Thank you for joining me as I begin my examination of the Screwtape letters by C.S. Lewis from my atheist perspective. In this video, we will be reintroducing the series and also covering chapters 1 through 4 of the Screwtape letters. And if you have been around with me on these Atheist Read series in the past and you don't need an introduction as to what this is and what this is all about, and you want to skip ahead to me responding to the actual text of the book, go ahead and skip ahead to this time in the video that is on screen right now, and you can bypass all of these preliminaries, and we'll catch up with you when you get there. For those of you who have remained to hear the introduction, this is the 24th An Atheist Read series that I have done. It is the second to last Atheist Read series, at least that I will do for the foreseeable future. As I announced at the beginning of the previous series about William Lane Craig's On Guard, this year will be the final year that I do the An Atheist Read series, at least for the time being. I'm going to take a nice, long, healthy break. I'm not saying I'll never, ever do another one, but I'm not going to do any more for a while. And the second to last book that I have chosen for the series is The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, who also was the second author that I ever reviewed in this format. My second Atheist Read series was about Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And the reason that I have done all of these series, the reason that I do the An Atheist Read series to begin with, is it is my hope that I can give any atheists who might be watching this some kind of a starting point as to how they might respond themselves to some of the arguments or some of the claims or some of the points being made by Christian apologists. I know from experience in my younger days when I was given a work of apologetics by a well-meaning friend or a relative or someone who was a Christian and viewed me as a non-believer as a seeker or as someone who wanted questions answered or someone who was on a path that they hoped would eventually lead to Christianity. I could read the book, I could comprehend the arguments and the claims being made, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was that I disagreed with or why I didn't find it persuasive. And one of the things that really helped me was reading and watching other atheists respond to those books or to those arguments or to those authors. And I hope that I can do that for you. If you are watching this video and you have been handed a copy of Mere Christianity or the Screwtape Letters or the Case for Christ or whatever the case may be, hopefully by hearing what I have to say about these arguments and these claims, etc., it will give you a starting point as to what you think, as to what you have to say. So my hope is not that you will parrot my responses or my counter arguments, but that I will inspire you to formulate your own, to focus your own thinking on the matter and come to your own conclusions, because I've found that to be very helpful myself in the past. So this is by no means intended to be a definitive response to C.S. Lewis or anyone else that I've ever examined in this series. It's my response as an atheist, just one person reading these books from my point of view, with my education, with my background, with my biases, and saying, here's what I think about this. And hopefully that will encourage some of you to better be able to formulate and articulate what you think about it. And if you are a Christian watching this, I hope that I can give you a fair representation of one atheist's response to some common Christian apologetics arguments. And I hope I've been able to do that from time to time in the past, and hopefully I'll be able to do that again as we go through this series. Now, as I said, this particular series will be a response to the Screwtape Letters. It was written by C.S. Lewis, who most famously is the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, and he also wrote Mere Christianity, which was the second book I ever reviewed in the An Atheist Reads format. He's a beloved and respected writer and one of the foremost and most influential Christian apologists. The Screwtape Letters was originally published in 1942, and that same year, Lewis also published The Case for Christianity, which was a transcript of a series of talks that he had given on BBC Radio that would eventually be republished as part of Mere Christianity. So in a sense, this book that we're about to review originated at around the same time as Mere Christianity, the previous C.S. Lewis book that I reviewed. Screwtape was the fifth novel that Lewis published, and it was published 8 years before The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which was the first book in the Narnia series, which catapulted Lewis to international fame. Unlike Mere Christianity, which was a nonfiction work, a more traditional work of apologetics, the Screwtape Letters is not a typical apologetic, although it does argue for Christianity and it addresses issues related to the church and faith. It takes the form of an epistolary novel, and it's sort of a satirical novel. It's the first work of fiction that I've reviewed for the An Atheist Read series, and it combines the two things that Lewis is best known for, his storytelling and his Christian apologetics. So it should be interesting, hopefully. Screwtape is a fairly short book. It's only about 160 pages, but it contains many chapters. There are 31 chapters plus a concluding section titled Screwtape Proposes a Toast that Lewis added in 1959. I will review that as well because it is included in most modern editions of the book along with the original 31 chapters. So in this series, I will cover 4 chapters per video. And when it's complete, this series will consist of a total of 8 videos. Now, welcome back those of you who fast-forwarded ahead to skip the introduction. Let's begin our examination of the Screwtape Letters with Chapter 1. As I said, the book is an epistolary novel. It takes the form of a series of letters written by Screwtape to Wormwood, and both Screwtape and Wormwood are demons. Screwtape is the older, more experienced demon, while Wormwood is Screwtape's nephew, and he is younger, and he's still learning the finer points of tempting humans to damnation. So the letters that will comprise this novel will be Screwtape's letters to Wormwood, and they are carrying out a correspondence. Wormwood is also writing to Screwtape in this, but we do not get to see Wormwood's letters. We only see Screwtape's answers to Wormwood's letters. So the story begins in medias res, as we pretentious writers have to say, with the first chapter consisting of Screwtape responding to an earlier letter from Wormwood. In his letter, Screwtape discusses some of the problems he sees in Wormwood's methods. Screwtape warns Wormwood not to be naive and believe that he can keep his subject, which is called the patient. That's the human that Wormwood is trying to tempt away from God. The patient, and God is called the enemy. That's how these demons refer to these various people. The subject they are tempting is the patient, and God is the enemy. And Screwtape is warning Wormwood not to think that he can keep his patient from the enemy merely by exposing him to arguments in favor of materialism. Because humans these days aren't as swayed by notions of truth or falsehood, Screwtape warns, thanks to the press and other such weapons, which Screwtape claims credit for on behalf of all of his demons. Demons are responsible for the state of the press in this book. Because of that, humans are less likely to be moved by reason and are more interested in whether a doctrine is practical or contemporary than in whether or not it's true. Screwtape urges Wormwood to make his patient think that materialism is strong or stark or courageous, because that's how modern people think. Don't try to persuade him that materialism is true. Persuade him that materialism is of one of these other qualities. Screwtape warns his nephew to avoid trying to reach his patient through logical argument at all. Quote, "The trouble about argument is that it moves the whole struggle onto the enemy's own ground. He can argue too, whereas in really practical propaganda of the kind I am suggesting, he has been shown for centuries to be greatly the inferior of our Father below. By the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reason, and once it is awake, who can foresee the result?" And this winds up being the main point of this first chapter. Don't try to argue people out of Christianity, because Christianity is better equipped to win rational arguments, while Satan, our Father below, has the advantage when it comes to propaganda. Screwtape says in that passage I just quoted, if you engage in argument, you move the struggle to the enemy's own ground, meaning God's own ground. The area where God is most comfortable and most effective is rational, reasonable, logical argument. Lewis, through Screwtape, depicts reason and also science as allies of Christianity, as things that one should avoid if one wants to keep a person away from Christianity or from finding or knowing God. Screwtape urges Wormwood to avoid using science, and in particular, the real sciences, by which he seems to mean natural science, the so-called hard sciences. Screwtape says that if he must dabble in science, keep him on economics and sociology. Presumably we're meant to recognize that these are not the real sciences and are therefore tools of Satan. There's a little bit of that satire that also reveals Lewis's personal viewpoint here. Physics and the other real sciences, on the other hand, are threats to the efforts of demons like Screwtape and Wormwood because they positively encourage the patient to think about realities he can't touch and see. And that's a quote from the book. Well, I think the best point of entry here is to say that I just fundamentally disagree with how Lewis characterizes science in relation to Christianity. And I would add in relation to all other religions as well, although Lewis would not. Lewis focuses squarely and specifically on Christianity, as he usually does. Lewis has his demon, Screwtape, warning against science because science encourages people to think about unseen realities, while the demon wants to keep the patient away from God by maintaining his focus on the ordinary things of life. But while science can show us unseen realities in the sense of revealing things about the world that we don't usually notice, the things it does show us are things which can be observed, tested, and measured and predicted once we know how to see them, once we know how to find them. They are parts of our physical, natural reality. And while they may lead some people to think of God or a divine design or some other religious or spiritual thoughts, there's nothing about them that necessarily points in that direction. Lewis and many other apologists would like us to believe that merely contemplating nature as it truly is and coming to have an accurate understanding of it will point people necessarily in the direction of God, because we'll see all of this magnificent order and we'll say, how did this come to be? And we'll start to think there must have been a grand designer. There must be some great supernatural intelligence behind all of this. And of course, that is not what science actually reveals at all. It doesn't stop some people from being inspired to those thoughts or from finding their way down that path anyway. But there's nothing necessarily about the findings of science that points to a divine creator or designer. In fact, over the last few centuries, the natural sciences have allowed us to see and understand a world that requires no gods or supernatural forces to account for it. In the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte was talking to Pierre-Simon Laplace, the great scientist who had been his teacher at École Militaire, and I apologize for my dreadful French pronunciation. That is the name of the military school that Napoleon attended as a child and a teenager. And they discussed Laplace's work, Celestial Mechanics, which is this epic 5-volume book about celestial mechanics that Laplace published throughout the early 19th century. Napoleon was talking to Laplace about this work of his, and he said, in Newton's book, he spoke of God, but I found no mention of God in your book. And Laplace answered, I had no need of that hypothesis. And that conversation took place in the early 19th century, around 1802 by most people who have reported on it. That was over 200 years ago. And the sciences were already revealing to us a universe that operated with no need for any intervention from God. Eventually, science would allow us to discover much about the history of the universe, about where it came from, how it came to be as we see it today, and the God hypothesis became even more inessential. It's true that science doesn't lead directly to atheism. It's also true that belief in a God isn't necessarily incompatible with the acceptance of the findings of science. It depends very much on the nature of those beliefs. But it's not necessarily, it's possible to believe in the existence of a God in some form and also fully accept the findings of science. But what science has done relative to God is it has rendered belief in God optional. And since it's possible and even easy to use the findings of science as the basis for a completely naturalistic view of the world where everything works just fine with no need for a God anywhere at any point. If I were a demon trying to lure people away from belief in God, I don't think I would be as anti-science as Screwtape. Of course, I don't believe in demons any more than I believe in gods. I don't think science is either of God or of the devil. I think both concepts are useless, practically speaking, because neither the God of Lewis or the demons that Lewis is depicting here actually exist, by my reckoning. Although, I do unfortunately know quite a few atheists who would agree with Screwtape and Lewis that the social sciences are of the devil, though they probably wouldn't put it quite that way. One last thing from this chapter. Screwtape begins this first letter of the book by telling Wormwood to avoid relying on argument, and later also he includes science in that, because modern people don't think in terms of true and false, and therefore they won't be persuaded by such notions. But if that's the case, how are reason and science effective tools for God? If people don't respond to rational arguments and evidence anymore, why should a demon worry so much that they might hear about some science? Seems like a little bit of an inconsistency there in Screwtape's methodology. Well, let's move on now to chapter 2. And in this next letter to Wormwood, Screwtape begins by expressing his disappointment that Wormwood's patient has converted to Christianity. This is a development now in the book. Previous to this, Wormwood's patient was not a Christian. Now, between letter 1 and letter 2, the patient has converted to Christianity. And Screwtape is not all that happy about this, but he follows up this expression of his disappointment by reassuring Wormwood that many new converts have been reclaimed by their side within a short time. Because the demons still have the advantage, Screwtape says, because the habits of mind and body are still in their favor. One of their greatest allies, actually, Screwtape says, is the church. And not the true church, he emphasizes, not the eternal church that exists beyond time and space, but the earthly church that people can actually see, the church of buildings and priests, etc. Spending time in his local church will only remind the patient of how human and imperfect and unattractive his fellow Christians are. And that's a good thing for Screwtape and Wormwood and their purposes. Quote, "Work hard then on the disappointment or anticlimax which is certainly coming to the patient during his first few weeks as a churchman. The enemy allows this disappointment to occur on the threshold of every human endeavor. He leaves them to do it on their own, and there lies our opportunity. But also remember, there lies our danger. If once they get through this initial dryness successfully, they become much less dependent on emotion and therefore much harder to tempt." Screwtape also encourages Wormwood to cultivate the patient's vanity. Handled properly, he won't connect the vices and shortcomings of his fellow Christians with his own. He will see their imperfections as evidence against the validity of Christianity without the thought that he, with all his shortcomings, can still be a Christian ever occurring to him. And when he talks of his own sinfulness, even on his knees, it's all parrot talk, Screwtape says. He doesn't yet fully realize what it means to be a sinner. He has no actual humility, and he assumes that he gets a lot of credit with God, the enemy, simply for converting. As long as he continues to think that way, Wormwood will ultimately prevail, Screwtape assures him. Well, this second chapter is much more pointedly addressed to Christians reading the book than the first one was, it seems. The messages Lewis means to send via Screwtape stand out fairly obviously, at least to my reading. Those messages pertain to the hypocrisy or shortcomings of the earthly church or other Christians, and how these shortcomings and hypocrisies are not evidence against Christianity. How converting to Christianity is the beginning, not the end of something. True humility must be learned and acquired over time, and it consists of more than simple declarations of one's own sins. There are theological reasons for Lewis to stress this to his readers, that the earthly church is not the true, transcendent, eternal church. After all, God is said to be perfect and all-powerful and all-benevolent, etc., etc. So obviously an imperfect, easily corrupted human institution like the church can't be taken as a sufficient representative of him. It just doesn't make theological sense to posit a perfect eternal being and then to say this imperfect worldly institution is a sufficient representative of him. So it makes a kind of philosophical and theological sense. But there are practical reasons as well why an evangelist / apologist such as Lewis, at least as he is functioning in this book, would want to underline the shortcomings of the church. By acknowledging the hypocrisy and corruption of the church, Lewis minimizes the impact of non-Christians pointing those things out. Of course, the church is full of hypocritical and flawed people, Lewis can say. That is the state of humanity. That is why we need God's grace. He can take that argument against his position and turn it around and make it appear to work for him. And in doing this, Lewis is doing what apologists almost always do when confronted with a mark against their case that they can't simply ignore or wave off. He's turning it to his advantage by admitting it, by pleading guilty and admitting how unworthy, but also how desperately in need of God's mercy he and his fellow Christians are. It's actually a very clever way of making Christianity essentially unfalsifiable. You point out how unholy so much of the church seems to be, and instead of denying it or arguing against it, the response is, well, of course it is. We live in a broken, unholy world. That's why we need God. Let's move on to Chapter 3. Chapter 3 sees Screwtape focusing on the patient's relationship with his mother. He advises Wormwood to coordinate with Glubose, who is the demon who is in charge of Wormwood's patient's mother. And he advises Wormwood to work with Glubose to cultivate an environment of mutual annoyance and daily pinpricks in the house. Apparently, the patient lives with his mother. He lives with his aging mother, has her in the house with him. And Screwtape says, if you can foment discord between the patient and the mother, if you can inspire some tension and some conflict between the two of them, then that's really good for us. And he recommends 4 methods to Wormwood to help set the patient and his mother against each other. And those methods are to keep the patient's mind on himself and his conversion as a matter of his own inner thoughts as opposed to his outward behavior. Move him to keep his prayers for his mother spiritual and vague so that the prayer doesn't lead him to caring more for her and her problems. Make the patient more aware of the many small gestures and facial expressions of his mother's that annoy him, and encourage the patient to deal with his mother using a double standard, whereby he demands to be judged charitably according to his words and his intentions rather than his tone or his insinuations, while he judges his mother in the most uncharitable way possible. Screwtape also asks Wormwood if the mother seems jealous at all of her son's newfound faith. Is she resentful that he never embraced Christianity despite all her teachings during his childhood, but now as an adult he has found God and he's making a great deal of fuss about it now, as Screwtape says. Well, this is an interesting chapter because I think the point Lewis is trying to make here is useful for everyone, not just Christians or people seeking to convert others to Christianity or defend Christianity. First, Screwtape tells Wormwood to guide his patient away from praying for his mother's specific problems and to worry more about vague spiritual matters. As an atheist, I can dispense with the notion of praying for someone. That doesn't really interest me. But I do appreciate what Lewis is saying about getting specific when you want to help someone. The impulse to help might begin as something vague and undirected, but if it's ever to make any actual difference, it has to get specific at some point. If you care about someone and you want to help them, You need to talk to them, spend time with them, learn what their specific needs are, and how you could help them to meet those needs. Screwtape is worried that if the patient begins to pray about his mother's rheumatism rather than the general state of her soul, then he'll begin to empathize with her as the person she actually is rather than his imagined version of her. And it's interesting that Lewis doesn't have Screwtape worried that if he prays about his mother's rheumatism, then God will heal his mother's rheumatism and then give the patient this newfound proof of God's presence and God's truth. He's worried that by praying for his mother's rheumatism specifically, it will focus the patient's mind on his mother's rheumatism, and he will begin to care specifically and in a more concrete way about his mother as she truly is, and care about her needs and her problems as they truly are, rather than about some vague idea of his mother. Screwtape doesn't want that. He wants the patient to focus on the vague ideas and miss out on the specifics, because that won't tie him as strongly to his mother and to reality. And that's true of those of us, that's a good principle for all of us to keep in mind, whatever religious belief we may have. When we connect with people as they really are, and we come to understand what their specific needs and problems are, then we're better able to empathize with them as people, and we're able to help them more effectively. It's a good lesson that needn't have anything to do with religion. And second, I really appreciate Lewis pointing out how we use double standards when dealing with others. How many of us demand that we be judged on our purest and most benevolent intentions only, while also judging others according to the least charitable interpretation of their words and actions possible. I think we all do that from time to time, particularly when we're being criticized or feeling attacked. We plead innocent because our intentions were innocent, but if we're going to demand that standard be applied to us, shouldn't we also be willing to apply that standard to others? And if we reserve the right to judge others by more than their stated intentions, but also by the impact of their words and actions, whether those impacts were intended or even previously known by the person or not, if we reserve the right to judge people on more than just their stated intentions, then shouldn't we also allow others to hold us to that same standard and be willing to recognize and own the impact of our actions and the consequences of our actions and words that maybe we didn't intend or didn't foresee, but nonetheless caused to happen? It just seems fair to recognize and try to avoid that double standard. And this is an example of what is so fascinating and so frustrating about Lewis. Unlike most of the other apologists I've examined over the years, he's not a total loss. I don't find his arguments for Christianity to be persuasive, but every now and then he presents an argument that, removed from its religious context, actually makes a great deal of sense and contains a useful lesson. I'm still sore at him for implying that social sciences are of the devil in chapter 1. That's not cool with me at all. But he doesn't strike me as a dishonest or unreasonable person, generally speaking. Moving on now to chapter 4. The beginning of this letter in chapter 4 finds Screwtape chastising Wormwood for attempting to shift blame to Screwtape after having apparently failed to turn the patient against his mother using prayer. And Screwtape also mentions here for the first time that his nephew is a junior tempter, while he himself is undersecretary of a department. It's amusing, and again, one of the more obvious satirical elements of the book, to think of the demon who serves as the narrator and main character of the story being essentially a pompous middle manager in hell. Of course, hell would have pompous middle managers. Screwtape tells Wormwood that the best thing is to keep the patient from praying at all, or at least to keep the patient from praying seriously. And this can be done by turning his mind back to the simple prayers that he learned in childhood. And the idea of that isn't to get him to go back to saying those simple prayers, but rather to get him to respond to the memory of those simple sort of recited, rote prayers by having him try to pray in a more spontaneous, inward, informal, and unregularized way. And again, that last bit there is a quote from the text. The goal is to get the patient to get into a vaguely devotional mood, as Screwtape writes, that doesn't actually involve any real thought. Again, he wants him to pray in these sort of vague, general, cloudy kind of spiritual ways, not in any specific way. And if this doesn't work, Screwtape recommends more subtle methods. Quote, "Whenever they are attending to the enemy himself, we are defeated. But there are ways of preventing them from doing so. The simplest is to turn their gaze away from him towards themselves. Keep them watching their own minds and trying to produce feelings there by the action of their own wills. When they meant to ask him for charity, let them instead start trying to manufacture charitable feelings for themselves and not notice that this is what they are doing. When they are meant to pray for courage, let them really be trying to be brave. When they say they are praying for forgiveness, let them be trying to feel forgiven." Screwtape also recommends that Wormwood keep the patient's attention on his constructed concept of God rather than directed at God himself. And this is especially important because as long as the patient prays, there is the possibility that God will answer and reveal self-knowledge to the patient, and that will just make the demon's job that much harder. But as long as the patient keeps praying to this imaginary idea of God, to the thing that he has made, not to the person who has made him, as Screwtape puts it in the letter, Wormwood's cause will be helped. And in this chapter, Lewis returns to the importance of recognizing the distinction between constructed concepts of religion and the true reality to which those concepts are meant to refer. Just as the earthly church is a poor substitute for the true eternal church, a Christian's inner concept of God is a poor substitute for the real thing. By encouraging the patient to focus on his idea of God rather than the real thing, by keeping the patient from even recognizing the distinction, Screwtape hopes that Wormwood will be able to trap the patient in a kind of idolatry, so that he's not praying to the real God, he's praying to his imagined version of God, thinking that that is, in fact, the real God. And again, as with Lewis's notion that the earthly church is not the real church, and therefore cannot be used to challenge the truth or validity of Christianity, we have the suggestion that God is not what we think him to be, not what we imagine him as, but something else entirely, something beyond our full perception and understanding. In other words, the elements of Christianity, which we can see and hear and quantify and potentially challenge and criticize, are but pale shadows of the real thing. And the real thing, the thing that we must base our challenges and criticism on for them to have any validity, according to Lewis, are things that cannot be seen or touched or challenged or criticized. So it's a very comfortable spot for an apologist to work themselves into. And it's not unlike the notion that the Bible is totally inerrant, but only in its original autograph, which conveniently no longer exists and can never be examined. The way Lewis is setting this up, he wants to establish that all of Christianity is essentially in that same position. It's perfect in its true form. It's perfect in its original autograph. And therefore, that true form is that which our criticisms and our arguments and our challenges and our disagreements should be addressed. But we can't address them to that true form of Christianity because it's beyond our perception. So Christianity, in a very true sense, by Lewis's reckoning, is unfalsifiable and immune from human challenge and human criticism. It's very clever. It's fiendishly clever. And it's also a completely illegitimate and unfair form of argumentation. But what is apologetics but that? Even in the hands of a writer as skilled and obviously intelligent and eloquent as Lewis, and clever as Lewis, and witty and funny as Lewis, that's still what it is. So that's it for this video. I will be back in the next video to go through the next 4 chapters of the Screwtape letters, chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. I hope you will be there to join me. I've enjoyed this so far. I'm only 4 chapters in, but I enjoy this more satirical format. I think the idea, the concept, the conceit of the novel of having us only read Screwtape's letters, not reading what Wormwood is writing to him, so we can only infer what Wormwood is saying, and we get to see Screwtape responding and reacting to what Wormwood is telling him. I think that's a very funny idea. I think that's a very strong conceit for the novel. So it has a lot more going for it as literature than the other apologetics books that I have read. But so far, the actual content, the apologetics, the arguments for Christianity are not any more persuasive than anything else I've read in this vein. But we'll see how it goes. Hopefully it'll be interesting for you as well. And hopefully if any of you are reading the book along with me, you will at least find it more enjoyable, more palatable than many of the other books that we have gone through. So that's it for this video, everyone. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for coming along with me for this, the penultimate An Atheist Reads series. I'll try to make it as useful and enjoyable for you as I can. A reminder, as always, that if you enjoy these videos that I do, please like this video, share, subscribe to this channel, and also please consider helping me to continue making more videos like these by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of this channel. Your donations help me to produce these videos, the Atheist Reads series, and the many, many other videos that I make and will continue to make after the An Atheist Reads series reaches its final conclusion at the end of the final series of this year. I could not do this without your help and your support. So those of you who are Patreon patrons, whether you pledge $1 a month or $5 a month or whatever level, I thank you so much. I depend on you. I appreciate your support in the form of your Patreon patronage. And those of you who are watching who aren't yet Patreon patrons of mine, if you can afford it, if you think I'm worth it, please consider becoming a patron. I would love to have you aboard, and you can take advantage of some extra little perks that I offer here and there just for Patreon patrons, including getting a peek at the scripts for these An Atheist Reads videos before the videos go up. So just something to think about. I appreciate all of your support, and I appreciate your attention as always. Please leave a comment here if you have anything to say in response to anything I have had to say, whether you are a fellow atheist or you are a Christian or you are some other category of believer or non-believer. I'm very interested to hear what you have had to say in response to anything I or C.S. Lewis has had to say in this video. And I will see you next time.